Well, hey everybody, Pastor Aaron from Homestead Church here, and today we're talking about suffering. Welcome to Unapologetics. Okay, so suffering is perhaps I don't want to say but one of the biggest barriers people might have to faith in God. Because here's the thing, we say, if God is all good and all powerful, and there is suffering in the world, that doesn't compute. Because if God is all good and all powerful, why doesn't God do something about the suffering in the world? And that's a really good question. We don't understand it. We hate to see our family and our friends and ourselves suffer. For goodness sakes, we hate to see the injustices in the world and people across the oceans suffer. So what's up, God? Why we maybe shout into the ether, God, why don't you? Or how come? And those are really good questions. And suffering is real. And so today I'd like us to look at suffering from a really deep, let's not say a deep dive, but let's look at this from a nice heavy point of view in Christian faith. Now, first of all, we have to think about God. So if I were to ask you right now to describe God to me, if we were sitting having coffee or whatever, and I were to say to you, describe God to me, what would you say? How would you describe God? Many of us might be tempted to launch into that idea of describing God as, the old man in the sky, who is all powerful and all knowing and all wise and all the big powerful words, and the all knowing, those omni words, to be omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all of those fancy words. And none of us, I wonder how many of us would want to say God looks like Jesus. All the things that Jesus did, taught, said, were. How many of us would say that is what God looks like? And therein lies our first big problem. Instead of describing God as the way Jesus reveals God, we try to describe God in a way that was invented 300-400 years ago by philosophical some Christians who were good intentions. They had good intentions, but their outcome was horrific. And what I mean by that is they tried to describe God and prove God's reality by pointing to nature and pure logic. They left out all the Christian-y stuff, all the Jesus stuff, all the crucifixion, resurrection stuff, all the Holy Spirit stuff, all the story of Israel stuff. And what they tried to do was prove God's existence through observations and thinking. Now, while their intentions were good, like I said, their outcome was tragic. Because the God they ended up with wasn't the God we think of in Jesus. It was basically a philosopher's God, little g God, not big G God, but little g God. And the philosopher's little g God was not real powerful. We ended up with all the omni words, very all-powerful and all-knowing, and that's the way we describe God. But you know what? That God is easily destroyed through the presence of suffering. That God is easily destroyed when something hurts, something goes wrong, because that little g philosopher's God isn't much more than a glorified humanity. All of the wonderful things that you could describe humanity. What's the best in humanity? That's what God is. And you know what? In the presence of pain, that God falls to pieces. So that's what we have to really understand as we look around at the suffering in today's world, the COVID and all of this stuff, the evil and things. Why does God allow that? Well, looking at C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote in The Problem of Pain that God created all of this, and he gave you and me free will. He gave creation itself free will. And as he gave that creation and us free will, one of the outcomes is suffering. Cool thunder going on right now, right? Speaking of creation and free will, God doesn't control where lightning strikes. Sometimes it hits homes and lights them on fire. Sometimes people get shocked. Does God cause it? Does God stop it? No, because, well, the charge in the air happens to just go at that very moment and hit that exact point. Nothing but bad luck, really. And so C.S. Lewis writes that free will is a necessary outcome of God's creation. Suffering is a necessary outcome of God's free will creation. You can make awful choices, and I can make awful choices, which result in suffering. People can make evil choices to harm other people, which result in suffering. Cold fronts and warm fronts mix to create storms. Low pressure areas, low pressure, high pressure mix, causing tornadoes. However this whole thing works. Tectonic plates shift because the earth is. Now, it doesn't disprove God. It just shows the free will that God has made in this world. So the presence of suffering, everyone, if God were to remove suffering, God would remove what you know as life itself. And what you would be left with would be, well, I can only imagine a robotic existence. Imagine walking down the road and pebbles skittering out in front of you so that you don't stub your toe or trip. Imagine not being able to fall in love because you might get hurt and suffer heartache. God says, no, you might hurt yourself. I'm not going to. All of the things worthwhile in life would be taken away. And God wouldn't have relationship with us. We would be mindless slaves. And I know that word carries a negative connotation right now, but we'll have Landon take this out. Now, just because, like C.S. Lewis says, just because we put the the several words, but God can. 3 words. Nonsense remains nonsense, even when you say, but God can. So if God chose to create us and creation with free will, God cannot act in an opposite manner. Even if you say, but God can, nonsense. C.S. Lewis, this is so British. Nonsense remains nonsense. You could almost say that with a British accent. That would be great, wouldn't it? So, suffering here, guys. The first thing, we have to get our minds right on who God is. God is not the all this and all that and everywhere this and everywhere that the philosophers tried to construct in the 1600s. God is the one revealed by Jesus. Jesus said that he reveals the Father perfectly. So we have that. Get your mind correct about who God is. Second, we have to think about free will. God gives you and me and all creation free will. Free will necessarily includes suffering of some sort. And if you don't like life the way it is, well, then maybe that would be better. But most of us enjoy life as we know it and wouldn't want it to change at all. Another piece we have to think about here is when we demand that God act in a good manner to prevent suffering, because we call suffering bad. And so to that, C.S. Lewis and others, is there any time that suffering is okay? Is it always bad? Well, that's a very hard philosophical question, and most of us couldn't answer it. So therefore, we can't say that because suffering is here, it's always bad. It's always bad. And what is goodness? C.S. Lewis again says, be careful not to make it into greeting card LUV. Well, he didn't say that, I did. But the idea is that oftentimes we can demand upon God our pale human caricatures of love, our pale versions of what it means to be good and righteous, when God knows really what these things are. And our demands upon God are more like a child demanding that it's not fair that mom and dad wouldn't buy a candy bar at the store. So God's goal isn't a happy-go-lucky hedonism for you and me. God's goal is that we be in relationship with God and in a relationship with one another. That's God's goal. Suffering. What an interesting topic. Now, let's talk about how God relates to suffering. Suffering and God just doesn't point from on high and say, oh, that's too bad, buck up, y'all. Like I don't know, it's easy for someone to, when they're not suffering, to say, well, just feel better, okay? Thoughts and prayers. I want you to think about God as revealed in Jesus. God is revealed in Jesus. Jesus, revealing God, God being God, comes to earth, comes to us, and enters into pain itself on many occasions, but ultimately on the cross, in death, horrendous suffering. So I'd like to think of it as God entering into the pain of the world, entering into the suffering and claiming it for his own, holding it to himself as he dies, and transforming that pain into a bright eternity in the resurrection on Easter morning. So a Christian can say, yes, definitely, there is pain in the world. It's awful. We hate it. Suffering is real. The Christian can say, though, however that suffering exists, we know it doesn't have the last word. Resurrection does. That's the Christian hope. Pain does not have the last word. Resurrection does. Glorification does. Life may be difficult now. Life more than likely will be difficult right now. But hang on, because Sunday's coming. You know, for some reason I have Wilson Phillips, hold on for one more day, going through my head. Whatever. Child of the 80s. Jesus enters into our pain, claims it as his own, transforms it. And so that is the gift God gives to Christians. We can recognize suffering with clear-eyed, brutal, optimism might be too easy of a word. Realism, but with the knowledge that it is not the end, and that we partner with our God to end senseless suffering, senseless, needless suffering here, for whatever reason that may be. Because of race or sex or oppression or hunger or any of those things. Christians join with their God in eliminating needless suffering. As I end up today, I would like to say to you that suffering does not disprove God. Suffering should make us embrace God all the more, because it gives to us a clear-eyed, realistic view of this world, this creation, knowing that suffering is true, but that it does not have the last word. God and glory and resurrection are the last word. Suffering and our hope in Jesus should spur us all on to action, needed action, to eliminate suffering in this world, the suffering that we can, knowing that one day it will all be put aside. Suffering does not have the last word. It does not disprove God. Suffering is tragic, heartbreaking, but not the end. Thanks.